All right, Terry, thank you so much for being on with us to talk today about drone insurance. I think this will be a super helpful, awesome time for everybody to kind of dive into what is drone insurance, why drone insurance, what are the different types of liabilities that individuals have that insurance could potentially protect or insure against. And so we're just going to dive into all those issues. But first, Terry, why don't you tell us a little about yourself?
Hey, it's my pleasure, Jonathan. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to join you here and expand and maybe teach a little bit about drone insurance. My background is I was in the United States Marine Corps back in 1981 to 85, Special Intelligence. I was intercepted Russian code and stationed the majority of the time up in the Aleutian Islands. After that, after I got out of the Marine Corps, went to Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, got a degree in professional aeronautics with a minor in aviation safety and aviation business administration. After that, I ran a aviation aircraft charter department for a number of years, flying Grand Canyon air tours out of Arizona, and then went into the insurance business, aviation insurance, as a aviation insurance underwriter, and then became a broker and did once I became an aviation specialty broker, I worked for a number of agencies, learning the industry, learning the business, and then ultimately started my own company in 2003. So altogether, I've been doing aviation, aerospace insurance for just about 25 years.
Wow.
We started doing drone insurance 7 years ago. Primarily because we are at Transport Risk Management. We're an aviation specialty insurance brokerage, and we're also one of the largest insurers of aerial film production. And film production was one of the first industries to embrace the use of drones. And at that point, because we insure so much aerial film production, it was necessary for us to figure out a way to ensure their use of drones. And so we were actually the first brokerage to get involved in that. We worked with our underwriters, developed the first actual drone insurance policies. As far as I know, we wrote the very first drone insurance policy. And from that point forward, we've helped develop the policy language, technology, things like that. So we've been very, very involved and instrumental in the development of the industry.
Wow, that is some background. Kind of just starting off at a very basic level, Terry. Why should a person obtain drone insurance?
If for no other reason is asset protection. So anytime that you're operating something like a drone, an aircraft that can cause substantial damage to a third party, then you risk not only exposing yourself and your assets, but also if you're working on behalf of another party, an aerial film production company or a utility hires you to do a job, then they're also vicariously responsible for negligent hiring if you're found negligent. And it's no different in drones than it is in any other industry. In manned aircraft, happens all the time. The Travis Barker crash, that was the biggest claim on that was a non-owned claim by the company that arranged the charter. And so, from a drone standpoint, it's not just as simple as hitting somebody in the face. One quick example is there was a drone that took out hit a power line, took out power utilities, electric service to 2,500 people in the Mountain View area. And so 2,500 users, including gas stations and hairdressers and you name it, that's loss of revenue as a result of, somebody's negligence. And so that can, these can easily run into the millions of dollars. There was a claim in northern Arizona. A guy was flying a drone, crashed it, started a fire. He was billed over $500,000. So the exposure is real. If you've got $500,000, you may not need insurance. But the company that hires you is going to be concerned about that. And so they also buy insurance for their exposures. And in order for their insurance most often to be in effect, they're required to ensure that anybody they hire is insured, so that it reduces their own exposure to their insurance companies. So it goes all the way down line and up line, from the manufacturer's product liability all the way to the operator and the party that hired the operator. So at the end of the day, what it comes down to is asset protection and what type of assets you have to protect and what the exposure is. And so you just have to determine whether that exposure is something that you're able to absorb, or if it's something that you're better off transferring to an insurance company in exchange for a premium.
Right. So in law school, when I first learned about, really kind of the conceptual working with insurance law, insurance is really just boiling down to the trading of risk of liability to the insurance company in exchange for money. And that's really just it's going to be factored upon what type of liabilities that individual, the named insured, would have. And so, depending upon the types of activities, the industries, the relationships, all those things are going to cause everything to fluctuate. And so I think it'd be a really good opportunity now to just dive into kind of the people that might be listening to this, that they're going to be in different kind of buckets, if you will. There's going to be the recreational commercial flyers, the drone educators and flight instructors, people who hire drone flyers, or drone manufacturers, repair facilities, resellers, hobby shops, and then lastly, the party event planners and hotels that might have drones operating near there. And we can just dive into some of the risks and liabilities that they face that drone insurance might actually cover and be beneficial for them from a risk management standpoint. So from a recreational commercial flyer standpoint, kind of what are the typical types of claims and accidents and stuff that you're typically seeing? Because the AMA 2012 insurance report that was out that I read through, it had all sorts of things, of an eye injury to a child that was struck by an aircraft, and that was all the way back in 2012. And we've seen how many of those since then, where there was that kid in England, and I just saw something that popped up yesterday in Hong Kong where someone accidentally flew into a child, and you have an individual that was actually struck and killed by a large helicopter and other aircraft that crashed into people. What typically is going on there in the drone industry from the recreational commercial flyer side of things?
It's it's varied, and that's one of the real challenges is that at first many drone operators who for lack of a better description, are fairly new to the industry, new to this type of exposure, never really take into account. And one of those is, by far the largest number of claims results from fire. Really? Believe it or not. And that's not happening while you're operating the drone. So they typically think about it in terms of the drone causing damage while it's in flight. But in reality, the largest number of claims come from the fire that starts at night while the battery's overcharging, while during a crash and the battery starts on fire. And so those are exposures that are 24/7. They don't expire at the end of your hour. They're there all the time. So anyone who hires you is going to require that you have insurance. If you're charging batteries at their location, in their buildings, things like that. Another one is premises liability. It has nothing to do with the operation of the drone, but it has to do with cords running around, with people on the premises. So if you enter my commercial premises as a vendor, and then your activities cause somebody else to be injured, then that's another big exposure, and that's the second largest cause of claims, believe it or not. And so those have nothing to do with the operation of the drone itself. And so that's something that many operators don't take into account. They don't even think about it, because they only think about the time while that aircraft is in flight. And those are CGL coverages, okay? Fire legal liability, premises liability, medical payments. Somebody just falls down and breaks an ankle because they tripped over your cord and fell downstairs, whatever the case might be. Workman's compensation. And so these are claims that can occur that are not covered under things like hourly insurance, for example. Okay, because they're CGL coverages. Now, and they're not related to the liability arising from the operation of the aircraft. Now, the third, then we move into the operations of the aircraft, and that is flying in close proximity to people. We've had no less than 7 take down power lines.
Wow.
Hitting power lines. And when you do that, you expose yourself and whoever has hired you downline to lost revenue to the power company, lost revenue to everybody downline who lost power as a result of that operator's negligence. And so that has, again, nothing to do with bodily injury, right? That's third-party property damage.
What's the average or the lowest claim made on those power line accidents?
Because
I'm like, what's the lowest number? And I think it's going to be a very large number, the lowest one.
We've had one that was very that the individual was lucky. It was we paid the claim because it totaled the aircraft, and it was $113,000 aircraft. So that was just the physical damage to the aircraft claim. The liability portion of the claim was $32,000, and it was really just a result of repairing the line. And so it was in an area that didn't cause a lot of downline damage. And the other losses that have occurred have been people who have simply not been insured. So they're on the hook themselves. There was a fire in northern Arizona. It was a crash of a drone. It started a wildfire. And that's a $500,000 claim just to pay for the firefighting and response. And that was an uninsured operator. And so those are things where the reality doesn't hit the operator until after the loss. However, companies that hire those operators trust me, it's not lost on them. They're sophisticated. They have risk managers. They have attorneys. And so many times, one of the biggest problems that we see, I don't want to get off on a tangent, but we see many operators will bind insurance coverage, then cancel coverage shortly after, within 24 or 48 hours, and then continue to use the insurance documents indefinitely. So we see fraudulent use of our documents constantly. And so in those cases where somebody hires an operator and they do what they're supposed to do, they ask for proof of insurance, things like that, but then they're presented with a fraudulent document. Fortunately, we insure a large percentage of the operators out there and the people who hire them. And so it's not uncommon for our own certificates and documents to come back through us for verification. And so we do catch a lot of fraud. And so those are things that we deal with in the industry right now is are they covered? And how do you prove that? You ask for documentation, certificates of insurance, verification of coverage, and then you've got to verify that, number one, the coverage is still in force. Number two, that the aircraft they're actually using is insured under that policy, that they're not using, a Inspire that's different from the actual Inspire that's insured under the policy.
Right.
So there's a lot that goes into it.
Right, because they could have crashed it at they crashed it and they didn't want to tell you because then that's going to raise all sorts of red flags, right, with you. And so they're keeping you in the dark and flying the other Inspire. And how are you to know the difference? Or
they're saving money by trying to insure 10 aircraft for the price of one. Because the reason that they're carrying insurance, unfortunately, one of the biggest causes of loss that we see in drones is cultural. And so it's not, the operator isn't necessarily buying insurance or receiving training or following regulations because they're doing it, out of concern for protecting assets or wanting to operate safely. They do it because they're required to by some third party. And that's a big difference. And so at that point, they essentially just want a piece of paper that says they're insured. Now, another reason why sophisticated customers who hire drone operators require annual coverage, complete comprehensive insurance coverage on an annualized long-term basis, is because they need, claims can come up years later. As an attorney, you understand that. So, a loss may happen today, but you don't see the actual claim or suit filed for 18 months. So customers want to see a certificate of insurance. They want to be named as additional insured, waivers of subrogation, but they also want to see a 30-day notice of cancellation or material change to the policy. And in those cases, that's impossible to do with short-term coverage. And so all of those are reasons why an operator would carry coverage, is because they need those comprehensive CGL coverages, plus they need the liability arising from the operation of the aircraft. And many customers require much higher limits than are available through other sources, 5, 10. We insure drones, believe it or not, at Phantoms and Inspires with a $500 million combined single limit of liability on each one. So the sheer limit requirement is a reflection of what the exposure is.
Right. It depends upon, who's involved, right? Going back to the relationships, who's involved. If it's somebody that's maybe not important, right, the limits of liability are going to be very low. But looking at, for instance, the Enrique Iglesias accident that happened, right, where the guy, he got his finger chopped up, but what happens if what would have happened if that Inspire would have actually, nicked him in the throat or something and ended his singing career, right? What would the claims be there? So depending upon who you're involved with, you might need way higher limits of liability than you normally think you would. And I don't think people really kind of realize that from just the recreational commercial side of things, but then also with the event planners and the companies that are hiring these individuals. And so we've kind of discussed, the recreational commercial guys, but then let's switch over to also kind of focusing in on these companies that are hiring. You mentioned that there's people using fraudulent documents. Kind of what can you dive a little bit more into there as to what's going on and what's the best way to limit your liability with dealing with those individuals?
Okay, so what we do, how we solve that problem, number one, there's no difference, again, in drones than there is in any other type of aircraft. So I'll use the film industry because we are one of the largest insurers of aerial film production. So we insure the actual production company who hires the aircraft operators. And so they carry big limits, $100 million to $300 million. And it may be for 2 days or 3 days of production, and you have, major motion pictures. And so at the same time, they have to verify that anybody that they're hiring is also covered. Why? Because, let's use the helicopter example. Vic Morrow was killed during the filming of Twilight Zone. Helicopter crashed and he was killed by the rotor. And he was one of the actors, and there was also another child killed. And so the film production company was sued as a result of negligent hiring of the operator. Let's get a little more recent. Just recently, the movie American Made with Tom Cruise. They hired an aircraft operator named Alan Perwin, who owned Helinet, or was the founder of Helinet, but he also owned Team 5, which is a drone operator in the film industry. Alan was one of the best-known film pilots in the world. Well, he was flying in the Tom Cruise movie down in Colombia, American Made, and towards the end of the movie, he crashed the aircraft and was killed. And his insurance company denied coverage for a number of reasons. And now that means that the film production company is on the hook because they were carrying non-owned liability covering that exposure. Okay, so that non-owned liability extends to any party who hires you as an operator or even allows you into the venue. So let's use that as a concert venue, or let's use it as a conference center that allows you as a drone operator to operate on the property, or not only, let's say that in one case they give you permission, or in another case just fail to make you stop. Either way, you can be held. They can and will be held liable, particularly if the operator of that drone doesn't carry insurance coverage. They just keep going up line saying that you're responsible because you didn't stop them, or you're responsible because you hired them or allowed them onto the property. Now, what we had to do, if you insure through transport risk management, we actually issue a number. It's a TRM number and a data plate that goes onto each insured drone. Okay, so it'll be TRM 555, for example. And then we require you to provide us with verification of ownership, just like on any other amateur built or any other aircraft under the FAA regulations. And what is that proof? It's your Amazon invoice, payment receipt, receipts from wherever you bought the aircraft or components. And many times they send us pictures of the aircraft itself. It's things like that. So then we send you that data plate, and that goes on to the aircraft. So, and on that data plate, it has the TRM number, which correlates to the aircraft in our system. In the event of a claim or the FAA, we get calls from the FAA quite regularly on flyaways asking us who the drone belongs to or asking us if we're familiar with it. So in that case, it also says to verify insurance coverage, call Transport Risk Management. 866, whatever our number is, it's right there on the label. So a customer can look at that, call us, and verify coverage. But what happens, commonly what happens is we'll issue those certificates of insurance, and actually our system allows our insureds to issue their own 24/7 from anywhere in the world. But what they will do, we'll issue those documents, and then once they cancel coverage, they apply for a job, so let's just say for a film production job. They'll give them those documents to verify insurance coverage. Well, the documents showed that they were, coverage was in force for 12 months. If you don't verify that, you don't know for certain whether that coverage is still in force, or if you don't require that a certificate is issued to you in your name. So we online in our system and in our my SlideShare accounts, we do have a kit for companies who hire third-party operators that says, you must issue us a certificate of insurance with a current date that shows our name on it. It's not just a general to whom it may concern certificate, and it shows a 30-day notice of cancellation or material change. Now, in the event that that operator cancels coverage or changes it, you'll be notified. Okay, otherwise, then what we see is our customers will send it to us saying we want to verify that this coverage is in force. We'll look at it and say, yes, it is in force. They're in good standing. Everything's great. Or no, they canceled coverage. Coverage is not in force. This is a fraudulent document. And that happens at least once a month in our office. Wow. Operators present them with documents that are not in force, representing them as being current coverage in our name. And so when we do become aware of that, we report it usually to the state insurance commissioners, and we advise the customer who's hiring them that the document was not we consider it a fraudulent document.
Wow. Well, so there are some mechanisms there that you've put into place as to protect the customers who would actually hire these drone operators. But let's go through the hypothetical and say everything checked out, that they didn't use a fraudulent document, they were actually insured. Maybe they even went so far as to list the company that they're working for as an additionally insured. Are there still liabilities that the hiring company could face, even if that insurance was perfectly set up? Is there still any, risk of getting nailed from a personal injury attorney?
Absolutely, because here's the misnomer about an additional insured. If you're an additional insured under somebody's policy, that means that you are covered, but only for liability arising from the operations of that named insured. So if you're sued, so now let's say that the operator that you hired, you're named as an additional insured, they're negligent in their operations, and they're sued and you're sued as a result of their negligence. Then, yes, their policy will defend you. They'll cover you up to the limits of the policy. Now, one downside there is that the more additional insureds there are under a policy, it results in dilution of the coverage. So if you're an additional insured under a policy with $1 million limit, it doesn't mean that you have $1 million and they have $1 million. It just means that you're diluting it because everyone's sharing the same $1 million. You don't get 3 or 4 million because you have 3 or 4 additional insureds. You just have 3 or 4 parties sharing that limit. So you're just making the limit lower. So the odds of that limit being exceeded increases with the number of additional insureds that are named to the policy. Okay? So that's one issue. So if you're carrying non-owned coverage, then your coverage would respond as excess above that primary policy should the limits be exceeded, or should the limits be exhausted prior to your suit being awarded. All right. So that's one issue. Now, the second issue is if you as a hiring agent or hiring party is sued for negligent hiring of the operator, well, that's your negligence. That's not the operator's negligence. So that means that the operator's policy is not going to respond to protect you because it only covers you for negligence of the operator, not your own negligence. So in that case, you would have to have your own non-owned coverage. And again, non-owned coverage would protect you for your negligent hiring of the operator. And you see that it's very, very common. That's what's happened on this Tom Cruise film, is that the production company who hired the operator is being sued for negligent hiring, or was. And that's what the reports that we've seen, but that's not uncommon, because they're going to sue as many parties as they can, is what we see, or at least claim against, not necessarily sue, but a claim and a lawsuit, are either way. From an insurance standpoint, we respond to either one. So companies carry those coverages to protect them, for suits for their own negligence, in addition to negligence arising from the operator.
So if there were multi-party, it was like a multi-party type of operation, might you want to then limit the number of additionally insured people on that policy and kind of say, hey, I know you want me to be, but I'm not going to add you to my policy unless you're going to up the rate? Because at the end of the day, like you said, dilution there going on, right? Why allow them have access to that extra bit of protection, which is really going to be there for your protection, right? It's kind of like sharing a parachute. How many people can pile onto that parachute before it snaps and it doesn't do you any good? You might want to just tell them, hey, actually, you should go and purchase your own parachute to protect yourself. And that's what we're kind of getting into here with the non-owned type of stuff. So with the negligence that the individual actually does, not the drone service provider, but we've seen that happen in real life, like with the case that happened up in New Hampshire with the wedding party. I don't know if you want to dive into that, kind of explain some of that, because there was the negligent hiring, but that's not the only theory of liability, right? There's also failure to stop.
Exactly, and that's where the non-owned would if the venue was carrying non-owned, they would be covered for that negligence. The operator would be on their own. It would be their own problem to defend themselves. If they were insured, they'd be covered. If they weren't insured, that's their problem. But the venue's non-owned would respond to cover them for that negligence if they were carrying the coverage. And so when we name them from an insurance company standpoint, we're partners with our operators. So we want to make it easy for them to operate, and naming multiple insureds does not necessarily increase our exposure, because it doesn't increase the limit. We're on it for $1 million. $1 million is $1 million. And so we will add them to support our operators. and primarily because the company that hires them does not have operational control. So their exposure is going to be lower. It's going to be vicarious. The big exposure is the one who has operational control. And so for us, naming them doesn't cause us a problem, but for the operators, what you would see normally, and again, this is why you culturally, drone operators only think in terms of getting the job. I shouldn't say only, but many times only want that piece of paper. They just view it as blue insurance. It's insurance. That's all they don't know what's covered. They don't care what's covered. They just want to be able to get the job. And so what sophisticated operators will go out and get higher limits. As you add multiple additional insureds, it makes sense that your odds of diluting coverage or exhausting coverage increases. So now when we insure the party hiring the drone operator, that company is going to carry much higher limits. And when I say much higher, I mean, 100, 200 million. And so when we do that, we tell them that the operators must carry a minimum primary limit of 5 million, so that that there's a significant working layer there. And so sophisticated drone operators are also concerned about protecting themselves and their assets. So as they start to build up numbers of additional insureds, they will come to us and say, I'm just not comfortable with 1 million anymore. I'm going to need 5 million or 10 million for this job. Because if the worst case scenario occurs, then we're going to have, we're going to have a lot of parties sharing one limit. And so that's where it becomes important to have a professional who's advising you rather than, do-it-yourself insurance. And we can get into that, but it's very difficult to do in aviation. But that's what I do. I spend the majority of my time advising clients on issues like that. And then as far as sharing COAs, again, an operator who's under an agreement with a utility or a film production company that says, you must carry 5 million primary limit, and then you allow somebody else to operate under your certificate who's carrying a lower limit. Now, not only do you have, inadequate protection, but you're also in violation of your contracts. And then another thing is operational control. Most COAs, all COAs, require that the COA holder be in operational control of the aircraft. And so, allowing a third party to operate under your certificate, in a scenario that's outside of your operational control, just like in manned aviation, is problematic.
Right. It's kind of like, think of that COA or that waiver. Like, for instance, kind of what's going on right now is a lot of people are sharing certificates of authorization to fly in a certain location. What a lot of people are talking about is like with renting. I'm renting out my COA or my cow for night flying so that somebody, elsewhere can actually fly under it. So there's a whole aspect of operational control going on there from just an FAA standpoint. So we can, just set aside the FAA liability, right? We're talking about just the civil type of liability you might be getting from non-governmental entities. What happens there if, like, let's say a large power company starts not doing proper vetting of these people, or someone just finds somebody on Facebook and says, hey, pay me $50 and I'll let you rent out my COA to fly near that, that airport.
That's why we put together our kit for companies who hire third-party operators. It's very, very important that you go down that checklist and you receive the proper documentation, because doing that just only exposes you and your company and your organization to incredible exposure. Because in the event of a loss, we even just in physical damage, we had one that was an interesting loss where the company actually, it was their LiDAR that was installed onto the aircraft being operated by a third party. Well, the aircraft crashed and they came in. They were supposed to be carrying insurance coverage. They weren't. And now they had no means to pay for a $150,000 LiDAR. and the company didn't do their due diligence and ensure that coverage was in place. We see the same thing in the film industry all the time on manned helicopters and on drones, where they rent a red Epic or some expensive piece of equipment. Well, those companies want to verify that it's covered. They come to us and we give them that verification. So it's very, very important that you follow those procedures, or you find yourself in a potentially serious situation, either in loss of assets or third-party liability again. And now with you as the COA operator, or the COA holder who allowed somebody to operate under your COA, you're going to find yourself being sued, but you're not going to be covered because it's not your liability. That would not be defined as an occurrence under your policy. And if you didn't, verify that party was covered, then you're going to find yourself with a denial of coverage. Exactly what happened on the Tom Cruise movie in Colombia 2 years ago. And that happens all the time. And in manned aviation, the difference is that it's a mature industry. Most of the companies that are involved in it, understand, they have procedures in place. And airplanes are different because when you go to climb on that airplane, you can look at the document in your hand, you can look up at the tail and see an N number. Right? Or some registration number, and verify that it's the same number that's on your piece of paper. Well, drones don't have that unless it's a transport risk management insured drone, which has our data plate on it. Then you can look at that piece of paper and say, is that TRM 555? It is. Okay, we're good to go. So those are the procedures that the industry is learning, but it's taking time because it's new. And drone operators have unfortunately taken advantage of that. But as the industry matures, operators and companies who hire operators are becoming more adept at handling those situations. We had one for a high net worth client whose attorneys went through our policy word by word, and their risk managers, and we went through many, many what-if scenarios to ensure that they were covered in the policy. Likewise, for other clients, they have risk managers that we work with as partners, and we verify that what coverages should be in place, what should be required. And this is a construction company, a public corporation. So anytime they hire a drone operator or arrange for one, because keep in mind, it's not just hiring them, it's also arranging for them or referring them, something called referral liability. If you say, well, we're not available, but, my friend over here, I think that he's available, try and give him or her a call. Well, now you just referred them. And if they have a loss, that company that construction company that you just referred to your friend is going to come back to you and say, that resulted in a loss because you referred them. And we cover that for our insureds. So there are many, many, many pitfalls in drone operations from a liability standpoint, regardless of whether you're the operator, whether you're hiring the operator, whether you own the venue, because aside from, let's go back to the wedding, aside from the operation of the drone, there's also the fire hazard. There's also the cords running around. So it's premises liability, comprehensive or commercial general liability. And our policies cover all of that. But if you don't have it in place, then you don't have the coverage. Or if you place hourly coverage, well, it doesn't provide CGL coverages. And if you just started a fire, or you tripped somebody, or you dropped, somebody tripped over a box and fell down some stairs, now again, the venue's on the hook. So it's very important to have a comprehensive policy in place. And just real quickly, it's usually cheaper to have a long-term policy, about 9 cents an hour anywhere in the world. for comprehensive coverage. And where the benefit comes in is because of those CGL coverages, we include them in our policies for no charge. And those are 24/7, 365, anywhere in the world. That covers the smoke coming out of the overhead bin where your drone is. That covers the fire that starts in your client's place of business at night when the battery overcharged. That covers trip and fall because of your cords or your boxes, whatever the case might be. And so that eliminates the need for another $3,000 or $4,000 a year policy. So in reality, buying a comprehensive drone policy probably eliminates the need for carrying a lot of other types of coverage.
Wow. And just wanted to follow up on one thing. And as you said that the drone industry, it's so new. They haven't really been able to see these things. The aviation industry, for man that is very mature. It's seen a lot of these issues. And so one that I've been noticing that is just completely almost never talked about is negligent flight instruction, which from a manned aviation side of things, and my background as a flight instructor, that was one thing I was very concerned about. It was, improperly teaching them some piece of knowledge incorrectly, right? Or they had an improper, understanding of, and I didn't correctly validate that, or I improperly taught them some type of maneuver or procedure that then went out and killed them. And so from a drone standpoint, there we have how many different companies are running around doing these flight schools or workshops all over the place, even YouTube videos or online courses. And just because they are manned pilots doesn't even make them immune from that. I mean, I know of one online course right now where that's taught by a actual FAA certificated flight instructor, and then I saw it and it was just completely inaccurate. It was wrong, and I was like, wow, I cannot believe they got that wrong. But it just runs the gambit from the new entrants to all the way to the manned aircraft guys that are coming into this industry and kind of teaching people how to fly drones. And so could you kind of speak a little bit more to that? What risks maybe like the large companies could have regarding that, as to like maybe the internal training as well as external service providers, hobby shops, or organizations that are providing this type of training to individuals? Because is it just a one-time situation, or is this kind of like a lingering type of liability that stays around?
It's the exposures that you talked about from a flight instruction standpoint exist absolutely in drones as well. So in the event of a loss, and it's something, and in many cases it's a much higher exposure. Why? Because the people you're teaching to fly don't carry insurance. So that means that a personal injury attorney or somebody down line, it could be 2 or 3 parties down line, are going to look for deep pockets. And so from that standpoint, they come and they say, you're negligent, Mr. Drone Operator or Miss Drone Operator. And they say, well, I was just doing what I was taught to do. And this is what happened. So they said, well, who taught you to do that? Well, XYZ Flight School did. And so now they come to XYZ Flight School and say, he said that you taught him to do it this way. And if you had not taught him to do it that way, then it would not have occurred. And so do you have insurance? Or do we just add you as another party to the suit? So it absolutely, when something goes wrong, everybody points in every direction. And
exactly. Shooting's going on with the personal injury attorneys. They're going to be everyone's going to be trying to grab as many named defendants or other individuals to point the finger at to, if you will, kind of dilute the overall claim, right, on the other side, right? And so that it spreads the liability thinner, so that if there is something that there is a payout, then they have to probably pay a whole lot less. And what's I think the really messed up part about this is that people are probably running through their mind going like, yeah, but I don't do stupid this or that, and I always make sure I do correct information. I check to make sure I do it all correctly. And so could you speak a little bit more to kind of thinking in terms of how easy it is to get into a problem, not the actual possibility of getting a judgment or award against you?
Well, The downside of every type of professional or product liability is the fact that, number one, it multiplies. It's exponential. The more you put out, the more exposure you generate over time. And the more successful you are, the more exposure you have, because you're training more people or you're building more drones. And it never goes away. It just multiplies. And so in that case, whether you were right or wrong is irrelevant relative to your cost of defense. So can you, even if you're found not negligent or not legally liable, it still may cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars to prove that. And so if you're insured, you are provided a defense in addition to the limit. So that means that if you're covered for $1 million of liability and your defense costs were $300,000, then you really have 1.3. Okay, so the $300,000 of defense costs do not burn through your limit. So it's in addition to the limit. So in that case, in order to be defended and removed, found not negligent, not liable, you can bankrupt you just as fast. And then in the event that you are found negligent, let's say you just were teaching something wrong. And let's face it, how do you know? How does anybody know? Because a manual that was provided to you by a manufacturer 2 years ago said this is the way it's done, doesn't mean that it was necessarily right. What if they changed their manual?
Right.
What if their manual wasn't translated properly?
Right. Or the FAA. I mean, for instance.
Or the FAA.
Yeah. I mean, so I know a lot of people go, hey, it's in the FAA manual. And it's like, well, that might be a good place to start. However, that does not mean that's like your absolute defense to some type of negligent flight instructing claim. I mean, there's at least I know of one set of videos on the FAA's website right now that is just incorrect. And when I first watched, I was like, "Wait, what?" And because some people think like that the FAA, that there's these flight instructors and stuff over there that are doing all this stuff, and sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. It's actually just some company they subcontracted with who actually put together the material, and that stuff sneaks through the cracks. And if you're just kind of relying upon the FAA to be kind of like completely off the hook if you just quote and cite everything there, that's not exactly a wise way to go. There is things on the FAA's website that are factually incorrect that nobody's really caught. And then not only that, let's say you even have the correct amount of information, right? But the thing is should you have told that particular person potentially even more information? Right? I mean, there's one YouTube video out there that I know of on the internet where an individual said, hey, we did XYZ and it was perfectly legal. And I was like, yeah, it was perfectly legal, except for you didn't tell them one more piece of information.
That's an
which
omission.
Was incredibly valuable, and they were breaking the law because of it, because that individual on YouTube is not an attorney and does, because sometimes when you deal with aviation, it's not just you're dealing with the FAA here and the FARs. And some people, they think the whole entire world is basically Part 47, Part 48, 101, and 107, except for there are other parts of the regulations that do apply to the operation, such as like Part 137. Maybe you're spraying something with your drone. Oh, hey, you look on those sectional charts and there's like this white area. You're kind of like, what's that white area? Well, could that not be a special flight rules area? And you have to go look over in Part 93 and you're supposed to comply with that, like Grand Canyon, right? I mean, right. Come on, you're familiar with that, right? And so then they kind of go stuck in this little 107 world. And then they kind of advise people, and it's like, yeah, but you gave them correct information, but you did not give them some more information that they needed to know. And if they just kind of took that and ran with it, they would have been breaking the law with some other violation elsewhere. And so I think that when you get into drone flight instructing, it's a very dangerous, scary area to go, because the more people you instruct, the more liabilities are walking around, right? Waiting
And
to
you're just
bite you.
multiplying, and it just keeps multiplying. So and it never goes away. For as long as they're operating, it never, ever goes away.
Right. And so then, it becomes very problematic. There's certain things that maybe if they've had more training since then that is potentially cleaned, if you will, that bad information or something like that, you could at least be helpful. But at the end of the day, going back to kind of what I was saying there, the issue of whether or not an attorney gets a judgment against you is different than how easy it is to get yourself involved in a lawsuit, right? It's real easy to get involved.
And it's not necessarily going to be the person that you instructed. It's going to be a person that they injured.
Right.
And they're going to have no control over it. They're going to come in and say, they told us that you taught them to do this. And so that's what we're claiming. And here's your, we're serving you with the suit, or we're filing a claim on that basis. And so, a drone insurance, comprehensive drone insurance can cover that for, we can cover every aspect of an operator's company or their operations and their exposures, provided we know what those are. And that's what we do as aviation insurance professionals, is we try to determine what those exposures are and then recommend the coverages that you should carry to protect yourself from those exposures.
And the last two things I think we should cover here is kind of like problematic substitutes that people they think are a substitute for a proper insurance, but are not exactly, or it's not as solid as you think. And the two would be primarily homeowners insurance, right? And then the other one is that, hey, my AMA member insurance covers me. Can you speak to each of those as why as those are not really that helpful? They might provide some protections in some limited situations, but they're not something that you should completely rely on.
There's, the biggest issue was number one, going back to 2012 with the Huerta versus, Trappy. And at that point, they lost, and then it was appealed. And that's when drones were defined as aircraft. And so, when it was, Huerta versus Perker, then we get finished. Yes, the FAA has authority. At that point was where it became very, very vague relative to where the coverage would be and what would be covered. So homeowners policies exclude aviation exposures in aircraft. And so do business commercial general liability policies. And that's why we exist. And that's why our coverage are so broad, because it doesn't matter if you're operating a helicopter or you're operating a Phantom. Our policies, every other type of insurance is going to exclude your coverage. So that helicopter operator needs commercial general liability. They need aviation liability. They need all of those types of coverages that follow them around, because they're not the dry cleaner on the corner. They move from place to place. So in most cases, what happens in insurance is they're going to rely on your application. What did you represent to the insurance company? And in aviation insurance policy, we say, yes, you were commercially operating drones. You're covered for all of these coverages that are provided under the policy. Your homeowner's policy is going to say, you never told us about this. We're denying coverage, or it can be as complicated as we don't even know if you're covered. In most cases, I think that there's consensus that coverage would not apply under a homeowner's or under a general business policy. The AMA policy, I have to be honest, my understanding, I don't have a strong understanding of what's covered, but like many group policies, there are a lot of limitations, such as it has to be non-commercial, or it has to be at an AMA airfield or location. But and it doesn't mean that it's bad or that it's wrong. It just means that you have to understand what it is and to know that you're operating within the conditions of the policies that you're carrying and relying on.
Right. Well, I mean, with your homeowner's insurance in the AMA policy, the best thing to do is read it in depth and find out if the exclusions or if there's any definitions or anything that change everything, because it's really going to, I mean, we're dealing with contracts here, which is there's going to be a lot of in-depth reading as to find those things out. And those things might not be built exactly for what you're trying to do, especially commercially. And you might need to actually go and purchase some type of insurance. It's kind of like going back to the parachute example. Well, could you go and use a bed sheet, a really large bed sheet tied together with some rope? That's maybe, I don't know. It depends on how heavy you are, but could it do it? Maybe, but it's not designed for that. It might fail because it was designed for something else.
There are two areas in your policy, and it's usually you can look in the table of contents and look for exclusions and conditions. And those are, aside from the basic coverage information, you just want to make sure that what you're doing is not excluded from the policy, and that what you're doing falls within the conditions of coverage.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Terry. This has been a super helpful time that you've taken all this time to explain all these issues, these different liabilities and everything. And so if an individual wanted to contact you or find out more, what would be the best way for them to do that?
They can visit our website at unmannedrisk.com, or they can call us at the office at 720-208-0844, or just email uav@transportrisk.com.
All right, Terry, thank you so much for giving us that info and for taking this time to talk to us. I hope it was informative for everyone who listened. And once again, thank you so much for listening, and have a great rest of the day.
Sounds great. Thank you very much. It was my pleasure, Jonathan. Anytime.